And unless we don't do that, we can see people in Europe who are complaining about these procedures just because they consider this affects this. For example, problems in Paris, and so on. And I believe we need to be very careful with this. And that's what Carlos was saying. This is related to tariffs. And that's what I wanted to say because if not, I will speak longer. Carlos, you had a great intervention as always. And definitely, we need to keep on working in our pricing system. And we need to be careful. We need to communicate better. And I would like to discuss this at some point because we need to do something in some sense. And I would like to reflect on something very quickly. Sometimes we want to communicate what can be done, but not in a timely manner. But what could be the alternative to this? And we compare to the alternative, and we see that the alternative is not very good because it has already happened. There are regions, full regions in Latin America, that used to depend on fossil fuels. There were blackouts every week. The price of oil will increase, and there will be a crisis with the prices like the one you have in Europe. And I'm talking about Central America. This has decreased greatly, and they have a greater stability in prices. People have seen a decrease in prices or stabilization, but if we do not communicate well when the benefits going to arrive, then I believe there could be a backlash from the users. But the alternative, if we hadn't done that, would have been way worse. What if we hadn't developed the hydropower? Can you imagine that? And we need to articulate better the way we communicate without any doubt. And now I'll give the floor to Adelab. I'm actually going to talk about this other question. Felipe, are we ready to face these reforms in pricing? You do represent the distributors in Latin America with this new paradigm, redistribution, and this is the nature of the distributor is going to change. We heard that we need to modify radically the way we define the final prices, and from the vision as Latin American distributors, are we ready to implement these strong changes that we should do in the segment of distribution? Why don't you give us your vision? Thank you, Marcelino. And I would like to thank the organization, OLADE, the IDB, and Marcelino, especially as a moderator, and all of our colleagues in the panel. As Carlos said, I don't know if it's Carlos is in Spain. I'm in Madrid right now because it's more convenient. So it's great to be able to be here virtually from Madrid. Marcelino, I believe that listening to the rest of the panelists and regarding your question, I would say we're not ready. And I would like to transmit this sense of urgency.
I want to talk about opportunity and speed. As you have all mentioned, right now there is a disconnect between the efforts of the region for a transition towards clean energies and the demand. As Sebastián mentioned, as Carlos Costa mentioned, and as Carlo Batio mentioned, we normally talk about as governments and as regulators about switching among generation technologies. And that's all right. But we're lacking in something. And that's that in order for this energy transition to actually happen, and in order for us to cover and achieve the commitments from the 2030 agenda, we need for that distribution to move from a single direction network into a platform. The platform will have financial efficiency that will enable for efficient measurements and for the generation system to then meet the demand. I agree with Carlos in that we need to reduce the amount of losses. When we are calculating the loss of energy in the region, it's still too high in terms of energy efficiency. And we have committed since COP25, and we will be committed still in COP25 of 2030 to doing this. Now, pertaining to whether or not we are ready to meet these challenges, I would say that there's still a large gap in the quality of the services. First, because of the incentives, and then because we were mostly focused on having universal access for the service, but we weren't that focused on the quality of the service, and that's fundamental for the transition. In as much as we electrify the demand and we depend more on electricity within our energy mixes, the reliability in the system needs to increase. It's not just about reliability, it's also about resilience, because we are facing more and more frequent extreme climate events that are more powerful and harmful. Another point that I would like to highlight is that we have seen how the region is making projections. When we look at the energy policies published in each country, we see that we can differentiate between three different groups of countries. One is the group of Brazil and Panama, who consider that electrification will be duplicated. By 2030, they will reach close to 50%. Another group, which is Chile, Argentina, Costa Rica, and others, that will triple that electrification and electrify close to 60% of the demand. And then there's a group such as Colombia, Guatemala, and other countries that will increase that electrification fivefold. Now, what does that mean for the 28 COP? Well, it means that we need to have strong investments. And if we add to this the entire transition for the renewables that we will have, where we have about 307 gigawatts to 530 gigawatts of renewables by 2030, it is clear that the generation will be the hardest thing about the transition, and yet we don't want it to become the bottleneck of the transition. And that is why we understand that we need to take urgent regulatory measures now. And I say urgent because this is not a matter of the future, but it's a matter of knowing that all the benefits that we mentioned from the mix switch are not received in the demand because the grid is not prepared in order for traders to carry out their task. And that's what we're saying. So our capacity to connect all the points of generations of utilities in a timely manner will matter. And now, just a side note, the global trend in renewable projects are becoming smaller and smaller. Projects tend to be close to 15 megawatts, and that means that they are not connected to national transmission systems, but rather to local distribution systems. So what do we do here? Well, what Marcelino said, we create this dispatch dynamics where we need to have the possibility of monitoring the demand to provide unavailabilities, congestions in the grid. So the entire dynamics of the national distribution system is then translated into the local distribution system. Now, out of the electrification that we will see in the industrial polygons, electrical transformations will require transforming the entire system. Now, in terms of what Carlos Valle said about batteries, I fully agree. There are many variables to consider in this area, and one of the things that we should do in the region, and this is part of what we are undertaking in ADELAC, is to remember that we have more questions than answers right now from the regulators. So it is our role as traders or distributors or operators to reduce uncertainty. And given the paths we have tread in other parts of the world, we need to create a very clear roadmap and a very efficient roadmap for the transition. So to answer your question, Marcelino, are we ready? Well, from the point of view of the generation, I think we're prepared to face a new challenge. 80% of the mix in the region is renewable. However, from the perspective of the grid and the demand, we are not prepared. Excellent, Felipe. I think you discussed something clearly, and that's how we need to look further at the demand. We need to prepare the distribution system for electrification. Distribution will become decentralized, and we have spoken about how complex it is to invest in transmission. So perhaps distributed generation, whether we like it or not, will become a solution for the supply that we will have to embrace, and we will have to work further with distributors so that they can still have a feasible, profitable business in their hands. Now, Analia Rojas. Everyone spoke about users, right? So, let me ask, is it because of renewables that the tariffs are high? Oh, I like the question. Thank you for that disruptive question, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Aladdin, thank you to the IDB. Look, ACERA is a union of generators, and it also brings together partners. We have a very large value chain in the association. We have close to 150 partners, and most of them are generators. But what we want is to transform the energy industry, especially the electrical market industry. Now, I don't think it's anyone's fault that the tariffs are high, but I think we are responsible for conducting a transformation, and we need to organize that transformation. And of course, the way in which we carry out things will have an effect on the end result.
So we need to approach this in a time where the time is ticking, the time is passing. And I would talk about four things. First, a reduction in electric system. Why are we doing the things we're doing? We need to remember because we need to reduce the greenhouse effect gases emissions because we're burning carbon. And we need to do this. This is a social agreement. Before being technical or economical, then we should understand whose blame is it. And here we have an agreement from humanity and from the world that has done this voluntarily or not, mechanisms to leave behind the fossil and this kind of generation. Why is this relevant? Because we have most of the emissions of greenhouse gases. In the electrical system is normally 1/3 of these 3/4 of the energy sector. So 1/3 of the greenhouse gases are produced because we burn fuel in electric generation. So we need to phase that out. So which one of the fossil fuels, the most complex from the point of view of emission is coal. So we need to have that clear and then answer other things. How can we replace this that's going to be phased out? That's coal, and it's going to be gas, and it's going to be diesel. When and with which kind of technology? And this is a question that every country in the region has to answer. And we have technical researchers that are very valid. Please go ahead and see the research that SETA did for Chile. And I believe that this is key. We need to understand and do this as short as possible, as fast as possible. How many gigas do you need to phase out the coal or gas? In the case of Chile, for example, we have 5.5 capacities of gigas of capacity, and to phase out this first 5.5 gigas of carbon of coal, we need to replace that with storage. So this calculation gives us the answer. How much is this going to cost? So regarding this, we need to know if it's expensive or not. But one of the most important things is given the value to it, how much the transformation cost is to understand how much we're spending right now and what keeps our energy system up. In Chile in 22, we have 22 billion dollars that were destined to the electric system, but also to the industry, the primary fuel industry. But in 2021, this figure was 13 billion. So in less than a year, this was almost 9 million more, 9.5 billion more. Tell me if it's not an opportunity to understand that this is a decrease of the prices and access to the bioenergies. We are spending almost double of what could have been before war, before COVID. So that is the opportunity. Second pillar is safety, security, and phasing that out is important with the rotary machines that produce energy, inertia, and this capacity of balance of demand and offer. We have variables on both sides. On the demand, that is traditionally in the electric systems, and now we have variability in the offer because of the renewables. What do what is what is this balance going to come from when we have these rotational machines? And we need to understand we're going to have more useful technologies, and we must pay attention because that is a waste of time and it's going to be expensive. Storage is one of the most efficient responses. Not the only one, though. We don't have a silver bullet, but of course, this is going to be interesting from the cost point of view because it's going to be a reduction. So I believe the most important cross-cutting point is that we have a redistribution of the costs, and this is related to the externality of fossils that are non-internal. And we need to make a shift, and we need to transform the machines, the systems, the operations, and the criteria that nowadays are redistributing those expenses that used to be invisible or silent. They were liars, so to say. And let's go to this third pillar, competitivity. And this is key. Not only because of everything that transformation means, because I'm going back to the final user. We're doing this because of two aspects. One, environment, reduction, and sustainability. And number two, because we want to have an energy supply that is less expensive and more competitive. But this also means incentive and signs, signals, so the rest of the economies that need to develop because of the use of energy need to comply with what we're looking for. That is green mining, green lithium, green hydrogen. Everybody's talking about that in the region. We need to be competitive regarding renewables because if it's not like that, we're not gonna have green hydrogen. That's gonna take time. Chile, that's a country where there are 10 or 15 initiatives of green hydrogen, and the cost just only to produce 1 kilogram of green hydrogen that is competitive, it's $1 or $1.50 to be able to explore that, has as condition a tariff of 20 to 25% every megawatt hour in terms of renewable costs. This is a cost we are not achieving for many reasons because of inflation and the context that we have been seeing. And we are seeing this in the scalability of the hydrogen projects. We need to scale that. So competitivity is critical right now, and we need to solve that. And in terms of regulation as well. And I'm going to talk about this related to what Carlos was saying. The transformation we have. So if we're there in other sectors, it's not only the sector of transformation. We have generation, transmission, and we have a common factor. We need to recognize that. And these are the attributes that we need.
In the generation, we have balance conditions. It reduces emissions, but it provides balance for the grid. In transmission, the added transmission needs to be efficient. We need to use the existing infrastructure in a more efficient way. And in the distribution segment, we have to deal with one of the most essential issues for the countries, which is that the distributors need to have their investments recognized within the tariffs. The success of distributed generation does not just lie on will or understanding the importance of decentralization, but it also pertains to having adequate incentives to incorporate things such as smart meters or as having mechanisms for dispatch or self-dispatch in electrical distribution grids. And it pertains to all the instruments necessary to manage the demand that we require and that we wish to have. This is all done with equipment and technologies that need to be included in the grid, and they need to be paid for somehow. So we need to make amendments in all the technologies and in all the segments. And we have an issue with the territory. The territory is the fifth variable that we don't talk about enough in the technical forums, but it's the mother of all battles because we need to deploy an equivalent amount of hectares in renewable projects, either wind, solar, or batteries, and that will be in conflict with the territory. Indeed, territorial organization and the tools to do that connected to the institutional management that we have to do also call for changes in regulations, and we should remember that the vast territories available to us as a privileged region, if we compare ourselves to Europe, won't be a problem or something that we should work on. We need to understand where we can build and where we cannot. So those are the points that I wanted to bring up, dear Marcelino. Thank you so much. You mentioned something really important that we shouldn't forget, and that's that we shouldn't lose track of our goal. The main goal is to have aligned plans and define whether or not we can implement them. And I think the end concept is that this is not just about renewability, it's about being competitive as industries. The world is being electrified, yes. So what role do we want to play as a region there? And what can we take advantage of in terms of what we have achieved in renewables, and how can we take that one step further, such as creating new production chains, including hydrogen in our mixes. And as we speed up this transition, how can we leverage other vectors such as critical minerals? Of course, I'm looking towards the future now, and we have the challenge of the consumers. Consumers want to have benefits. So, how do we communicate those benefits to them? But we need to talk about where our economies are going and how energy will contribute to those future economies, not just for reliable, affordable energy, but also for the general benefit of society. So let's move on to Sylvia. We spoke about generation. We spoke about the need to recognize what the technologies contribute because we need to continue investing in generation. There is a large amount of things that we need to do. There are ancillary services that we need to consider. So, from the generation side, Sylvia, what do you think we need to do? Well, we are technologists, not just in energy storage, but in the thermal side, and in thermal all the way to sustainable. As a matter of fact, some of our projects are using hydrogen and other sustainable fuels. But what I do and what I represent now is the analyses for energy systems. My team has conducted 140 analyses across the world. And I want to later on discuss some examples, but before I want to make a more general comment about the key aspects to consider. First, if we believe that decarbonization is possible, we need to remember that renewables will make decarbonization possible if we incorporate them in our grids in a timely manner. The key is we need to identify what are the flexibilization needs that will enable integrations. And then we redesign the markets. We have spoken about the Chilean case. 3 weeks ago, we created a long-term model for Chile. It's a model from this date onwards to 2030 and then to 2050, and we discussed in that model why we couldn't stop using coal. If we do not understand what are the needs for flexibility that will enable us to leverage renewables, because in Chile we see that there are 3 companies, solar power companies, that went into bankruptcy. The curtail is incredible. We see that we have between 20 and 30% of renewability. We applaud ourselves and then we stop and we can't move forward. That happened in Chile, that is happening in Europe, and it will happen in other countries as well. So we need to identify how we incorporate those technologies. And that flexibility has 2 aspects. One, a short-term aspect, and that's when we have no sun because it's dark, and when we have no wind, we need something. And then we have to talk about seasonality. We won't be able to solve seasonality and its issues with storage. Some countries that are blessed with hydropower, such as Brazil, have used their reservoirs and their dams to regulate and to create a balance. But in many cases, they haven't even able to provide the supply necessary, meet the supply necessary through hydropowers. So what do we have? Demand respond. And then we have a 4th element, which is having flexible plants or stations. And those flexible stations have specific capacity. Those flexible stations, and Elia is laughing because surely she has heard me say this before. She's going to say we need to buy more thermal stations, and if not, this is not going to work. Yes, it seems counterintuitive, but I will say that because all the models we have ran and Irina and Bloomberg have ran show that if you cannot come in and out of the market quickly, efficiently, and if you do not have the power to counteract the imbalances where you have minimum capacity in one kind of technology, and if you do not have the capacity to come in and out in pulses to counteract the intermittent nature of renewables without increasing costs, we won't be able to have transitions. In Chile, you won't have sun at night, so you won't be able to take out that much coal and just have solar panels. You won't. So the difference between incorporating flexible stations that will now use natural gas and then switch in the future to sustainable gas, to sustainable renewables such as ammonia or hydrogen, we won't be able to do this. By having those plants, the amount of investment or footage in which you will have to invest will not be as expensive. So what the market should do is redesign and consider what are the flexibility needs. We can have synchronized condensers and generator condensers. But all those flexibility tools need to be modeled, identified, and included in our expansion plans, what we know as IRPs in the United States. If those dynamic parameters of each technology are not included in that modeling, we won't be able to visualize how the system will be reliable. Those combined gas cycles, those combined coal cycles won't be eliminated just like that unless we substitute them with something more flexible, and that is what we have to do. Eventually, then a mechanism will lead to more profit for those flexible stations. So redesigning these systems will consider maybe, or will imply maybe, that we ask ourselves, how do we attract those investments? Is it payment for capacity? Or maybe we need to send a different signal because those investments won't just come out of thin air. I do want to mention that there are two reports from Bloomberg New Energy that indicate that if we do not send out the signals to markets indicating that we need flexibility, investments won't materialize. And in consequence, what the markets are trying to do is to think about subsidy mechanisms. Well, that doesn't work. Sooner or later, those subsidy mechanisms will only lead to distorting prices, and they will drop at one point. Now, I think that depending on the type of market, whether it's a free market or a different kind of market, there are ways to ensure that those renewables are properly included. If not, we will have pointing fingers and people will say, hey, who's to blame? Are renewables to blame? No, absolutely no. I agree with you, Analia. It's not about blame. It's about the fact that they're not being integrated because we always think about having a renewables plan and of including more renewables, but it's not about including megawatts. It's about decarbonization.
So this decarbonization plan doesn't relate directly to the amount of renewable comes in. It is important, but if this renewability doesn't come with the stability, then it's not going to move forward. So in my case, I would say that incorporating renewables, it's what we have been thinking about. We have been in the race of bringing so many megawatts to the table and thinking about the prices, but we are not taking advantage of that, and the tariff is high. So who's to blame? Renewables, and that is a never-ending story. We need to be flexible enough and need to identify this. So great intervention actually, because that makes us discuss what we want to discuss, and this is very important. So every system has different flexibilities, and we need to understand what every system is going to need, and this needs to see that deeply, how the system sees that short term we're going to dispatch regarding seasons, and we cannot have these false dilemmas of firm or not firm. And this is way more complex than this. We don't have one size fits all solution. It's going to depend on the system, so to say, and we need to go deeper into the figures, because I hear very often that we talk about, or actually more coal, less firm. No, let's go deeper into the technical restrictions of the system, because actually we have the systems like in Uruguay, Costa Rica, a lot of hydropower, many interconnections, and we don't mention transmission. That is the cheapest solution to handle variability. So we need to understand deeply what is the flexibility of every system and how you will need to adapt this, and given the market signals. And maybe we close with this, so we have the investments. And traditionally, I don't know if you mentioned this, there were costs that somehow were not identified, and they were there under the carpet. And every time a coal plan or a CICLAC that comes in and out is there, then we have additional costs that have been hidden. And then send the invoice, and someone has to pay for that. So in that expansion modeling for the future, we don't establish these dynamic parameters. How fast can they go in? How much is that going to be? And then we're going to have technology that is better positioned than others. And this is not modeled, this is not put into the numbers, and there are no payments in Chile. Every time these coal plants, when we ask them to do things they were not designed for, let alone cut them out of the system, we have additional costs of millions of dollars that go to the tariffs or that the government pays, if this is something that was politically decided. We're talking about flexibility from the generation in the way the market works. Why don't we do the following? Regarding the traders and distributors, we haven't talked about the flexibility on the demand. We know that's not easy, but from the demand, that can give us a lot of flexibility to the system. First, our colleagues from the Traders Association, Felipe, sorry, Sebastian, what about the demand? What kind of flexibilization can we have? And I'm going to ask Felipe, and then we're going to close with the biggest questions of this market design, with incentives, with Carlos, and with both Carlos, Valle and Costa. And we are going to go to some questions, because I believe we have an interesting panel regarding demands. What kind of solution to motivate these responses? What do you believe that the traders should do and put on the table? First of all, discuss what we were talking about, the agreement. I believe there is an important agreement on the goals that we have for the future. As Analia said, it's macro objective, that is, have a zero emission grid. And I believe this needs to be validated. It cannot be among specialists. It needs to be also with the industry, the government, and the vote. I believe that is choosing the supply. The user votes in the electric market, choosing their supply. If we don't give them a chance to vote, there is no validation, no social validation, because in the industry, the governments are there, and I agree. But the election by the user, final user, is important. So they say themselves, I want to buy these renewable energies, and I know I have to pay more, and I agree with paying more. I don't want to do this if I don't decide that by myself. If not, then we have this problems like the issues like the problems we have seen in France. If there is no flexibility, then the user cannot participate in the market, and that is a problem. Nowadays we have a zero tariff, no additional cost. We can also discuss if it's zero or not, but I believe that the margin cost is zero and you cannot participate in this from the final user point of view. But nowadays, the clients that can participate, they're going to have higher cost of energy at night, but they can adjust some processes. Of course, they're going to have three schedules and then just one. They cannot work more, so they can only work during the day. Maybe that's fantasizing, but we can adjust that so we can have a less of of a load, of a burden. But regarding participation, we need to understand the user's needs, and the system is there for them. We cannot expect that in the industry or at home people only take a shower during the day and not at night, even if the marginal cost is zero. And we have to work on that, thinking that the user needs to be willing. And some years ago, we run a survey with a surveying company, a polling company. I think the name is Criteria, and it was 78%. 70% of people were willing to have a higher tariff instead of having a blackout for a couple of hours. So it is actually for them was better to cut that service for a couple of hours instead of having to pay more. There is flexibility, but we need to know when to incorporate that. And I believe that the management system has these demands. And we have that, and we didn't have this before. We can facilitate everything so that the user participates. That is a dream. It's going to end just there. You're mentioning something important, that the flexibility sometimes exists, but it feels easier than it actually is. But we need to work because sometimes we had tools we didn't have before. So the first time I had these scheduled tariffs in the US, I said, I'm going to do the laundry during the night. But then I had to buy a new one because it couldn't fit the door in the basement. It's going to be $50 more, and that's it. I couldn't buy it, and that's it, the end of it. This is the thing, but might be easier actually. I had a scheduled tariff for a used electrical car, and I said, okay, let's try it, and it worked. But then when I realized that actually the difference between night and day was almost nothing, then I said, why do I do this? I just plug the car and in time because I don't have time and I don't have any signal for the price. But if I had something that were very smart and the car would plug or unplug by itself or programmed, maybe I cannot leave and go to the garage minus 5 Celsius degrees. There is a technology, but then we need to use it. But you could also choose the tariff as well. Yes, that's important. Yes, you can choose, and you can say, I'm going to use the solar energy from a community. It is the user. We need to participate as users. From the demand, Felipe, regarding flexibility, and where then the two Carlos, I'm going to talk about the generation market, what Sylvia was telling us. How can we give more signals to invest in more assets? Because we're not going to have a size fits all. We cannot split the market into two. So Felipe, regarding offer and demand, and then Carlos, and then the Q&A session. Well, very quickly, I would say very quickly, I would say that flexibility is one of the key words of what energy transition means for distribution. That is, from a type of grid that is rigid to a platform that allows for flexibility that is expressed in the co-influence of many agents and many dynamics in real time regarding distribution. I just wanted to summarize this. But there is something that is important here, that before flexibility we have some minimal requirements and some previous step that we need to take very fast so we can have this flexibility that has many benefits. But with signals, I mean the example you gave us from your electrical car in the US. I'm gonna make a comment regarding this and regarding the grid. So again, we have identified in Adelar 11 groups and families of investment, and the grid needs that to solve this mismatch from the past. We have this energy, this is the loss, this is the demand of quality, and beyond that, we need to face the challenge of energy transition as well. These 11 families of things is improving quality, resilience, digital platform, creating sensors in the grid with high tension, low tension, especially telecontrolling the grid, also achieving the mechanisms and digitalization of the grid assets. So this is flexible in real time. This dispatching that's going to happen with the distributed generation, it's gonna go to the consumer. So this all becomes reality, and this energy efficiency that is tiled from is part from the intelligent measuring with the scheduled tariffs, and we need to take all of this into consideration. Marcelino, you were saying something that it was a great example. There are things that we take for granted, and sometimes when we have extreme cases, for example, when we economically don't see impacts that have actually great impact, having a flexibility could be more relevant. So when we could match the fact that to have smart measuring in every point, and we have sensors when there are restrictions like the one Sylvia mentioned just now. Of course, you can bring this to the real time as a signal so the demand responds economically speaking, and also regarding consumption behavior. And this means also something that is very costly for the country. So what happens nowadays in Chile regarding restrictions and problems regarding projects that are using the renewable energies in the north of Chile, what's going on in Brazil, they have problems with the scheduled tariffs because even if they have a renewable grid, or like the case in Colombia, they will need to be more flexible. And I would say that to achieve this network, this great flexibility, we need to keep on working on that. Carlos already mentioned this, but this would come from a concept.
In the case of the distribution grid for the next few years, we're not just talking about marginal investments to make the grid organically grow every day, but we're talking about incremental investments. What we are seeing right now in Europe is a fourfold multiplication in the volumes of investments for the grid. And this is a step we need to take in Latin America. The other part is that the income needs to be timely provided. Let's look at Brazil. Every 5 years, we look at the model. The model that existed was convenient for a marginal growth of the grid, but it's no longer suitable for the transition. And we also need to establish real costs and incentives, incentives in quality, incentives in resilience, in the protection of losses, and we need to have incentives so that distribution companies can safely invest. And those investments do not have the same certainties for their assets than they had in the past, of course. Some are differential. So for these assets, we need to change the logic urgently. Analia, we were talking about the fact that consumers want to make a choice. We have been successfully including megawatts in our country, and that was included by making contracts with regulated users. And as you keep on going up, you need to have complementarity within the system. You need to continue attracting the necessary technologies, and you need to send signals out for investors in terms of solutions on the side of the energy market in order to have an attractive generation market. What are these solutions for Chile? We have an agreements market that is regulated, but nowadays that market is only 40%. The other 60% is the free client market or installed capacity market, and normally people directly negotiate with generators. So what we have seen basically is that we have changed prices as renewables disrupted, when we saw companies that were offering cheaper and cheaper prices. And then we saw a turning point in 2021, 2022, when the prices were on the rise again. And it is likely that for the next tender, we will have regulated clients tenders, and that will be reflected in the amount of agreements entered into by free clients. We will have prices and tariffs that will be less affordable than those between 2015 and 2017. Now, from the perspective of incentives, the biggest signal that we should send out is that of recognizing sufficiency and the sufficiency offered by different technologies. I believe all the countries in the region need to look at the methodologies to define sufficiency and how they contribute to what we want to incentivize. There are multiple methodologies. We recognize efficiency from the moment of peak demand until the point of loss. Those methodologies are all under discussion, although they won't always benefit or incentivize us installing more renewable energies because, for example, solar energy during the late hours of the day decreases, so it's not sufficient. Hence, if I want to continue decarbonizing and removing fossil fuels from my mix, do I just need solar power? And the answer is very likely no. I will need other technologies, and I need to be able to pay the generators properly. Of course, we need to be sincere and honest about the discussion of costs and non-internalized costs, and I think we have abandoned that discussion. But in Europe and in more advanced markets, this discussion was arrived at in terms of a conclusion, and that's having a tax for emissions. If we do not have a cost for emissions included in the variable cost of the dispatch in the system, it's highly unlikely what we won't have shifting. The gas that has half of the emissions of CO2 and doesn't have the same pollutants than coal won't be used if we are not sincere about the price for emissions so that markets regulate themselves effectively. So there are two pricing mechanisms: potency and sufficiency, a signal for flexibility, for all the technologies that give a balancing capacity to the grid, the hydro pump, etc., are all renewable technologies that will provide us flexibility, and we need to send out signals of that. And then we need to be honest about what it costs to contaminate by using fossil technologies. In Chile, we are quite far from that. We have a carbon tax of $5 equivalent CO2. That's an average that we recommend. It's of $35. We feel that politically speaking, we really can't have much more of an impact on that. But if we look at carbon taxes in other spaces, they have been able to send out a clear signal for shifting or of having alternate technologies. You spoke about costs and recognizing the benefits. You spoke about the cost of fossil fuels, and you spoke about the benefits of renewables. And you spoke about ancillary services as well. Yes, designing tenders is important for that. We have affordable prices. Our tender systems will award the most affordable offer. So we need to be more creative and more realistic about the types of energies that we want to include in our tenders and include those incentives. The next tender in Chile
Una rebaja equivalente a $15
will actually provide a discount of $15 when the system comes with a storage system. And we need to move quickly into including these kinds of incentives. It's not just about adding megawatts and megawatts per hours, but it's also about offering attributes. Silvia, do you want to react, and then we move on to the last question with the two Carloses? A couple of things. I want to mention 3 countries that are at the forefront in flexibility and talk about tenders, because nowadays there are countries in our region that think about the typical LCOE assessment criterion rather than consider how that project integrates and decreases costs in the system. They continue fostering combined turbine circles, which apparently would be the most efficient and the most affordable thing, which makes it so that renewables cannot become flexible, and we will have issues in benefiting the system, albeit it seemed to be the most affordable opportunity. But there are a couple of countries that I would like to mention. One of them is, for 2032, the EPE recognizes 15 gigawatts of flexible capacity. It's not just any capacity, it's flexible capacity. By 2032, Brazil recognizes it. What does that mean? It means that the dispatcher and the regulation indicates that they need to have full operational flexibility. The dispatcher calls you and you go in. You can't say, I'm not ready. You can't say, my technology takes half an hour to reach 100 megawatts or whatever you promised. So what I'm saying is, what are the technologies that we need to foster? Those that can pump in and then leave quickly, because that's what the system will require. And they need to do that without adding additional costs. That's what happened in Brazil previously, because they didn't have the right regulation. Generation came in, and then when we had cycles and intermittency, there were additional charges that were not contemplated in the LCOE. And those are costs that will be incurred in once that station jumps in. In the Vietnam case, the same thing happened. This is one of the first countries that recognizes in its expansion plan flexible generation. And I think they recognize about 2 gigawatts of flexible generation specifically. And the same thing applied for several countries. So there are very few countries that, from the regulations perspective, are trying to implement a regulation that might incentivize these flexibility attributes. Why? Because we believe we are going to go for the cheapest project, and that can backfire because we may end up attracting inflexible assets, albeit they seem to be more affordable, or we're going to get an incredibly affordable capacity in its capex, but because it is very inefficient, like a high-speed machine that can go in quickly, but then it's very expensive. So we need to move towards new concepts, such as the concept of flexibility, and plan for that. Flexibility, quick comment, Santiago, then Sebastian, and then we move. I'm sorry, I'm getting bombarded. I am so sorry. Sebastian, you wanted to say something, and then Carlos? Yes, very quickly. In terms of the discussion for tenders and agreements, if I recall correctly, Brazil has spent in the last 4 years, has not conducted any regulated tenders. They have entered into agreements with private parties only, and that's because the state has been able to participate through the BNS in having methodologies that evaluate in a more flexible way the agreements with a 4, 6, or 8 year prospect. So we have coverage and guarantees that are being executed at those terms, and that is why they haven't been conducting any regulated tenders. In that way, the offer has significantly expanded. Thank you kindly, Sebastián. Let us move on to Carlos Valle. Can you tell us how you have been designing those incentives in the market for the future and how you are working on this in Spain? You heard about the Brazilian example and the Vietnamese example in generation markets that continue attracting investment as you have more renewables in the mix. So, from what you see in Europe, what's the prospect? Okay, so I want to contradict Analia. She talks about Europe as a more advanced system than those in your region, and I fully disagree. The Latin American regulation, believe me, is much more advanced than the European one, and I have spent a long time working with the European Commission. I continue working there, and I teach them things that I learn in Latin America. I need to say that I learn from you. Now, having said this, I don't want to expand on my comments because I see that people have questions, but the European experience and the experience in the United States lets me to say sometimes, hey, it's great that I only work for regulators because there are so many things that we need to tackle, and sometimes it's hard to do it.
I believe Marcelino already said this very well. That depends on every system. There are systems where you can lack some tools and some other things, but it seems to be there's always something missing. But of course, they're different. They have a different reality. So things we have learned, or the session we're discussing about, the response to the demand. At residential level, we have discovered that even in times, I mean, price it at tenfold the same price, it's either way, people don't react. If the richer don't react at all, like Marcelino said, it's just not something relevant for them. So people don't realize what they're saving and they don't care. That happens in Europe as well. They are skeptical regarding this, regarding flexibility. So the dilemma we see is that sometimes when we have assessments and we see markets where this is valued, at the end we reach the conclusion that there is less money than we expected and we are still behind. We would need more efforts. Either way, we are growing with more state intervention. The Italian government has included this, and I have worked in many countries. They have mechanisms for capacity, what used to be known by the name of firm power. And the government in Italy is working differently. But what's missing in Latin America are complementary balanced markets, something that already exists in Europe, but the thing is, didn't exist in South America because it was not worth to do that. In Brazil, there's still a lot of hydropower, and maybe in 2030, 2031, we might need it, but we still have 8 years. So I believe it's important to make things slowly. There is a certain risk in trying to convince politicians and regulators that they need to advance. And I believe we need to be patient because if not, things are not going to be possible. It's not going to be possible to pay everything. And in Europe, we have seen this circumstance as well. In the end, the situation is let's focus on mechanisms for the market and let's try to create this. In Chile, we haven't discussed this. I was already there in a forum 5 years ago, and this is not ready yet. And once they're implemented, maybe you can see the real value, the real need. But until then, we're only talking about possibilities, as Marcelino said. That depends on demand and offer. Until we don't have priced tariffs or scheduled tariff, we will not discover what the consumer wants. But maybe we discover it's quite the opposite. They might discover it's not worth it. Thank you, Carlos. Carlos Costa, a final reaction. And I want to have just two answers from the audience. I want to have a final reaction to the thing of the future. I would only summarize two topics. One, regarding regulations, business, and politics. Regulatory, I agree with Felipe. We will change the model. We need to change that cap price. We need to recognize the investments in distribution. And this goes downstream through signals and fixed tariffs to incorporate these costs. Regarding the business model, we need freedom for the distribution for the benefits of the final users. We need to change this because any additional income is discounted. And this has to change because the distributors do this by through the holding companies. And then also regarding policies, it is important to distinguish what is policy and regulation. I see people in Brazil discussing hydrogen regulation and definitely who's going to pay for the development of these technologies. And this is the same with the offshore. We know that the cost of offshore is double so much. And we are waiting for the Europeans to do so, but someone has to pay. And I agree with Sylvia regarding flexibility. And if you want to see an example of what you shouldn't do, see Uruguay with a combined cycle that is dispatched by 15%. This is absurd when we should have more flexible machines without paying a combined cycle that needs to be maintained. And since it's not dispatched very slowly, then it costs more. And the level cost of the calculated project is worse. And in the end, we bring energy from Brazil because it's cheaper to bring it from Brazil than to turn on the combined cycle. So we need to change the rules of the game, thinking of the project and regarding policies in the case of Brazil as well, that in terms of politics, they forced themselves to have these combined cycles with 8 gigas was enough. But this will, of course, bring worse situations for that. And the case of Carlos and Marcelino, it's not Carlos or Marcelino who's going to pay. It's the ladies, the homemakers, because we have to know this is poor people who live there in the continent who are the most. We need to leave the room, sorry, but I want to thank this great panel, and the conclusion is we have achieved so much with the instruments we already had. We are facing a challenge of adjusting these tools so that the user sees this and we continue in a path that is more sustainable and seeing productivity in the future of our economies. We need this urgently because we can not think for 10 years to have a new regulation on X or Y topic. We need to act very quickly. Thank you, Analia, Carlos Costa, Sebastián, Silvia. Thank you very much. I enjoy this panel very much. I hope you enjoy that too. Thank you once again. Thank you.